The HOA truck roared down my gravel driveway before I even had time to breathe. 10 inspectors spilled out, clipboards swinging, one already lifting a bolt cutter like it was a weapon of conquest. Their plan was obvious: intimidate, scare, take control. What they didn't know: I had my lawyer crouched behind the oak grove, phone in hand, sheriff quietly pulling up behind the barn, and a camera trained on every inch of my property. Every step they took, every confident smirk, was about to backfire. I leaned against the porch, calm but alert, feeling the tension coil like a live wire. Gravel crunched under their boots. The smell of hay, dust, and sun-baked earth filled the air. Their arrogance was thick enough to taste. I spent decades defending land like this veteran, rancher, heir, and today, these inspectors were about to learn a brutal truth. You never walk onto someone's property expecting compliance when they already have the law, the evidence, and the backup ready. Stay with me. What happens next isn't just a confrontation, it's a full-blown power flip. I'm a veteran, a rancher, and the third generation of my family to wake up every morning on this land. Out here, life isn't measured by street numbers or property values. It's measured by seasons, by fence lines repaired before sunrise, by how long a piece of land has managed to stay in the same family's hands. This ranch has been part of my life for as long as I can remember. A few hundred acres of pasture stretch out behind the house, broken up by old oak trees that have been standing longer than most towns in this county. The barn sits near the center of it all, its red boards faded by decades of sun and wind. When the doors open, the air carries that familiar mix of hay, leather, and dust that only working land seems to hold on to. Inside, pieces of the past are still hanging on the wall's old saddles, branding irons, tools that have been repaired more times than anyone can count. Down in the lower pasture, a narrow creek cuts through the fields. I used to spend hours there when I was a kid, sitting on the rocks with a fishing line, listening to the water move quietly over the stones. Places like this have their own rhythm: cattle moving through tall grass, wind brushing the tops of the oak trees, the slow, steady work of land that's been lived on for generations. But over the past few months, something had started disturbing that rhythm. First came the letters, then the inspections. And that morning, I heard the trucks again. The ranch didn't start with me. Long before the fences were straightened, before the barn doors were replaced for the third time, before the gravel road carved its slow line through the pasture, this land belonged to my grandfather. And if you really want to understand why I defend it the way I do, you have to understand the man who first put his boots in this soil. I still keep his journal in the top drawer of the old desk inside the ranch house. The leather cover is cracked now, the pages yellowed and soft from decades of turning. But the handwriting is still strong, tight lines of ink describing cattle drives, storms rolling over the hills, winters that nearly broke the herd. Sometimes at night I open it and read the entries. Not because I need the history, because I need the reminder. Grandpa wrote about the land like it was a living thing. Not property, not acreage, something closer to a partner. Something you respected or it would humble you. One entry I remember clearly was dated May of 1954. Ran the cattle down to the creek today. Storm moving in from the west. Land feels restless. Just one sentence. But when you've lived here long enough, you understand exactly what he meant. The creek he wrote about still runs through the lower edge of the ranch. When I was a kid, that creek might as well have been my entire world. Summer afternoons were spent down there with a fishing line and a rusty tackle box that had belonged to my father before me. I'd sit on the flat rocks along the bank while the water slid quietly over the stones, dragonflies hovering above the surface like tiny helicopters. Half the time I never even caught anything. Didn't matter. The sound of the current and the wind through the oak trees was enough. Those oaks are still there too. Massive things, older than the barn and probably older than the house itself. When I was about 10, my cousin and I tied a rope swing to the thickest branch we could reach. We spent entire summers launching ourselves out over the pasture, boots kicking at the sky, laughing like we owned the whole horizon. In a way, I guess we did. Later, when I was old enough, the ranch stopped being just a playground. That's when the real work started. I remember the first time my grandfather let me help during branding season. The air smelled like dust, leather, and wood smoke. The cattle moved through the pen slowly, their hooves thudding against the hard ground while the older hands worked with quiet efficiency. Grandpa handed me a pair of gloves that were 2 sizes too big and said something I never forgot. "Land teaches patience," he told me. "You rush it, you lose it." At the time I thought he was talking about cattle. Years later I realized he was talking about something much bigger. Because when you grow up on land like this, it stops being something you own. It becomes something you carry. Every fence post that gets replaced, every calf born in the spring, every winter storm that rattles the windows of the ranch house, it all becomes part of the same story. And the truth is, that story doesn't belong to any one person. Not to me. Not even to my grandfather. It belongs to the land itself, and to the people stubborn enough to protect it. That's why when people look at this ranch and see nothing but acreage numbers on a survey map, they miss the point entirely. Because this place isn't just property. It's memory. It's family. It's identity. And anyone who walks onto land like that thinking it can be pushed around with paperwork and intimidation has absolutely no idea what kind of fight they just stepped into. By the time those inspectors rolled down my driveway, I had already spent most of my life learning how to deal with situations exactly like that. Just not usually with clipboards. Before I ever took over the ranch, before I spent my mornings fixing fence lines and my evenings checking the herd along the creek, I wore a very different uniform. I served in the military for nearly 2 decades. Most of those years were spent in environments where patience mattered more than speed, and where the wrong move could turn a quiet situation into a disaster. The Army teaches you a lot of things. How to read Terchoshan to a lot of things. How to read terrain. How to watch people. How to recognize the difference between confidence and arrogance. But more than anything, it teaches discipline. The ability to sit still when your instincts tell you to react. The ability to think 3 steps ahead while someone else is still trying to figure out the first. That habit never really leaves you. Even after I came back home to the ranch, traded combat boots for work boots, that mindset stayed with me. Problems get handled the same way. Observe first, move second, and never step into a confrontation without knowing exactly where the exits are. Around here, people know that about me. This county isn't very big. Word travels fast when you've lived in one place long enough. The sheriff and I have known each other for years long before either of us had gray in our hair, back when we were both younger men trying to prove ourselves in our own ways. These days he runs the department, and I run the ranch. But there's a level of trust that comes from decades of shared history. Same goes for most of the neighbors. Out here, respect isn't something you demand. It's something that grows slowly, season after season, the same way crops do. People see how you handle trouble. They see whether you panic, whether you cut corners, whether you treat others fairly. Over time, they make up their minds. And most folks around this valley know one thing about me. I don't start fights, but I don't back away from them either. Protecting this ranch isn't just about property lines or legal paperwork, it's something deeper than that. Every acre carries the weight of the generations who worked it before me. Every fence post marks a piece of history that can't be replaced once it's gone. So when someone decides they're going to push their authority a little too far, when they think intimidation and paperwork are enough to take control of something that took decades to build, they're not just challenging a rancher. They're stepping into a fight with someone who has spent his entire life learning exactly how to stand his ground. Every story like this has someone who believes rules make them powerful. In our case, that someone was the head of the HOA Compliance Committee, a woman named Elaine Whitmore. Now, I've dealt with plenty of difficult people in my life. The military introduces you to every personality type imaginable, but Elaine was a very specific kind of problem. The kind that doesn't come from strength or experience. It comes from a clipboard. The first time she showed up at the ranch, it was early afternoon. Sun high, wind moving slow across the pasture. I remember hearing the engine before I saw the car, bright white luxury SUV crawling its way down the gravel road like it had accidentally wandered into the wrong zip code. Dust trailed behind it in a long cloud. The vehicle stopped near the gate, and a moment later she stepped out. Everything about her looked deliberate. Perfectly styled hair that hadn't moved an inch during the drive. Large sunglasses that reflected half the pasture back at me. And nails long, polished, immaculate, that looked like they had never touched a fence post or a shovel in their entire existence. In one hand, she carried a thick clipboard. In the other, a folder so stuffed with paperwork it barely closed. She walked toward the fence slowly, heels clicking against the gravel with each step. The kind of walk that said she believed she already controlled the outcome. I leaned against the gate and watched her approach. When she finally stopped a few feet away, she glanced over the property like a real estate agent inspecting a foreclosure. Barn, fencing, livestock pens, pasture. Her eyes moved across everything with the quiet judgment of someone who believed they were the authority in the situation. Then she lowered her sunglasses just enough to look at me directly. The smile she gave wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile people use when they think they're about to educate you. "Good afternoon," she said, voice smooth but sharp around the edges. "I'm Elaine Whitmore with the HOA Compliance Board." She tapped the clipboard with a manicured finger. "We've received several reports regarding potential violations on this property." Her tone stayed polite, but there was something underneath it. Something condescending, like a teacher explaining rules to a student who clearly hadn't read the handbook. She glanced past me again toward the barn and the pasture stretching behind it. "We just want to ensure compliance," she added, the words dripping with a kind of manufactured patience. Now, I've learned something over the years about people like Elaine. They believe authority comes from paperwork, from regulations, from the assumption that everyone around them will simply nod, apologize, and fall in line. But land has a funny way of exposing that kind of arrogance. And the moment Elaine Whitmore stepped onto this ranch, clipboard in hand and confidence written across her face, she made the mistake of assuming this was just another property she could push around. After that first visit, the letters started arriving. At first it was just one envelope, thin white paper, HOA letterhead stamped neatly across the top like it carried the authority of the entire county behind it. Notice of Compliance Review. That was the phrase they used. Inside was a list of supposed issues with the ranch, things that would have sounded almost ridiculous if they weren't written so seriously. According to the letter, my livestock pens weren't positioned within the preferred aesthetic alignment outlined by the HOA guidelines. The barn roof, which had been standing since my father's time, apparently needed to be repainted to match the approved community color palette. They even took issue with a section of fencing that had been there longer than most of the houses in the subdivision down the road. At the bottom of the page was the real point of the letter. Fines. Daily ones. Not huge amounts at first, but enough to make their intentions clear. If the violations weren't corrected within 30 days, the penalties would begin stacking up. And if that didn't work, the next step would involve construction restrictions and formal enforcement reviews. In other words, pressure. But what made it worse wasn't just the paperwork. It was the way the HOA tried to turn the community against anyone who resisted them. A few weeks after the letters started showing up, someone forwarded me a screenshot from the neighborhood message board. My ranch had become a topic of discussion posts talking about unregulated properties, about how certain landowners weren't respecting the shared standards of the community. No one mentioned my name directly. They didn't need to. Out here, word spreads fast. Some neighbors started avoiding the topic entirely when I saw them at the feed store or the gas station. Nobody wants to get caught in the middle of a fight with an HOA board. It's easier to stay quiet and hope the storm passes somewhere else. But there were others too. Folks who had been dealing with their own compliance letters. People who were tired of being told what color their fences had to be, or how high their sheds could stand. They didn't say it out loud, but I could see it in the way they looked at me. Like they were waiting to see if someone would finally push back. Because here's something most people don't realize about HOAs. Their covenanters can sound powerful on paper. The rules are written in legal language, stamped with signatures, filed neatly into property documents. But those rules aren't unlimited. State property law still sits above them. And sometimes, especially when the land involved has agricultural protections or long-standing deed rights, HOA authority stops at the edge of the paperwork. That's a detail Elaine Whitmore and her compliance board either didn't understand or chose to ignore. Either way, the situation was clear. They were escalating. The fines, the letters, the public pressure, it was all meant to corner me into submission. But the problem with that strategy is simple. This ranch isn't just a piece of land I happen to own. It's my family's history, my livelihood, my reputation in this community. And if the HOA wanted a fight over it, they were about to discover just how serious I was about protecting it. The first letter was annoying. The second one was deliberate. By the third envelope, it was obvious the HOA wasn't interested in compliance. They were testing how far they could push. The letters arrived almost weekly now. Same clean white paper. Same stamped logo at the top. Same formal tone pretending this was all part of some reasonable process. Each one carried a longer list of violations than the last. One week it was the fencing along the north pasture. According to their compliance committee, the posts were inconsistent in spacing and created what they called a visual disruption to the surrounding community. Never mind the fact that the fence had been there for 30 years. The next letter targeted the livestock pens near the barn. Apparently, the HOA guidelines required agricultural containment structures to be placed a certain distance from any visible roadway. I remember standing there reading that one twice. The closest road was half a mile away. Then came the landscaping complaints. They claimed the grass near the lower creek hadn't been properly maintained according to HOA aesthetic standards. What they meant, of course, was that wild grass grows the way wild grass has always grown on ranch land. Nature doesn't follow suburban landscaping codes. But the letters kept coming. And then the inspectors started appearing. The first time it happened, I was repairing a fence line near the back pasture when I heard tires on the gravel road. I looked up and saw a white pickup truck rolling slowly toward the barn. Two men stepped out wearing bright safety vests and carrying clipboards. One of them raised a camera before I even reached the gate. "Inspection," the taller one said casually, snapping photos of the livestock pen like he was documenting a crime scene. I walked over slowly. "No notice," I said. The second man shrugged without looking up from his clipboard. "HOA compliance review." Just like that, like they had every right in the world to wander around private property taking pictures. Over the next few weeks it became routine. Different trucks. Different inspectors. Sometimes they showed up early in the morning while the fog was still sitting low over the pasture. Other times they rolled in during the afternoon heat, tires crunching loudly down the driveway like they were announcing themselves. Always the same routine. Clipboards, photos, notes, measurements. Once I caught one of them counting the boards on the side of the barn, counting them. I called the HOA office after that. The woman who answered transferred me directly to Elaine Whitmore. Her voice came through the phone smooth and calm, like someone explaining simple rules to a stubborn child. "Mr. Carter," she said, "we're simply conducting routine compliance checks." "Routine," I repeated. "Yes," she replied. "Your property has generated several concerns within the community." I looked out across the pasture while she spoke. Cattle grazing quietly, wind pushing through the tall grass, a ranch that had been running long before the HOA ever existed. "What concerns?" I asked. There was a short pause on the line. Then the clipboard tone returned. "Well," Elaine said, "for starters, your livestock containment structures appear non-standard." "My cattle pens?" "Yes. They've been there for 20 years. "That may be," she replied lightly, "but HOA regulations evolve." I could hear the faint tapping of her fingernails against the desk through the phone. Additionally, she continued, "Our inspectors have documented fencing irregularities, landscaping inconsistencies, and several potential agricultural zoning concerns." I leaned against the fence post and let the silence sit there for a second. "You realize this is working ranch land," I said. Another pause. Then she gave a small laugh. "Mr. Carter," she said, voice dripping with that same condescending patience she'd used the first day she showed up. "We just want to ensure compliance." That phrase again. Always the same line. But something had changed now. The inspections weren't random anymore. They were targeted. Inspectors walking deeper into the property. Cameras appearing more often. Phone calls coming in the evening asking about structures that had been standing for decades. It wasn't enforcement, it was pressure. The kind designed to wear someone down slowly. Most property owners eventually fold under that kind of attention. They repaint something, move a fence, adjust a structure, anything to make the problem go away. But every time I watched another inspection truck roll down that driveway, one thing became clearer. Elaine Whitmore believed this ranch would eventually do the same, that if they pushed hard enough, I'd fall in line like everyone else. What she didn't understand yet was that I had already started watching them back. At first, I told myself it was just noise. Paperwork, inspectors, phone calls, things you deal with when bureaucracies decide they need to justify their existence. But the truth is, pressure has a way of creeping into places you didn't expect. especially when it doesn't stop. The letters kept arriving. The inspections kept happening. And every few days another notice appeared in the mailbox outlining new violations that somehow hadn't existed the week before. At night I'd sit at the kitchen table with the stack of paperwork spread out in front of me. Each letter had the same language: calm, official, and carefully threatening. Failure to comply may result in escalating financial penalties. Further enforcement actions may be necessary. Continued non-compliance could impact property standing within the community. They never said the words directly, but the message was always there. We can make this difficult for you. And over time, it started affecting more than just me. My wife tried to stay positive about it at first. She'd pour coffee in the mornings and ask if the inspectors had shown up again. Some days we joked about the absurdity of it all, people with clipboards trying to manage cattle fences like they were landscaping hedges. But humor fades when the problem keeps growing. One evening, she sat across from me at the table while I sorted through another envelope. "How much are the fines now?" she asked quietly. I glanced down at the latest notice. "Technically," I said, "a few thousand." Her eyes lifted slowly. "Technically? They haven't enforced them yet," I explained. "It's more like accumulating threats." She leaned back in the chair, arms folding slightly. "That doesn't sound better." And she was right. Because the longer this went on, the more it felt like a cloud sitting over the ranch. Even the neighbors started acting differently. Out here, people usually wave when they pass your truck on the county road. It's just the way things have always been done. But after the HOA started their campaign, a few of those waves turned into quick nods instead. Shorter conversations at the feed store. People changing the subject when the ranch came up. Nobody wanted to get pulled into a fight with the HOA board. Those compliance letters had a way of spreading fear through the whole valley. If they could come after a ranch like mine, they could come after anyone. Still, there were moments when I caught something else in the way people looked at me. Not avoidance. Expectation. Like they were watching to see what would happen next. But inside my own house, the tension was harder to ignore. Late one night, my son asked a question I hadn't expected. Could they actually take the ranch? He was standing in the doorway of the living room, arms crossed, trying to sound casual. I set the paperwork down. "Not like that," I said. "But they keep sending letters. That doesn't mean they can enforce everything they write." He nodded slowly, but the doubt stayed on his face. And I understood why. Because when official documents keep showing up week after week, when inspectors walk around your property like they're measuring its future, it starts to plant a certain kind of fear in the back of your mind. Not fear of losing the land immediately, but fear of something slower, endless fines, public complaints. Reputation damage in a small community where your name actually matters. The kind of pressure designed to make a person give up long before a courtroom ever becomes necessary. And I'd be lying if I said the thought never crossed my mind. Because protecting land isn't just about fences and cattle. Sometimes it means standing against systems designed to wear you down until you finally stop fighting. But every time that doubt started creeping in, I remembered something my grandfather wrote in that old journal. Land teaches patience. And patience, as it turns out, can be a very dangerous thing for the people trying to push you. When pressure alone didn't work, the HOA changed tactics. That's when things stopped being annoying and started becoming personal. The first sign showed up in the local paper. It was buried halfway down the second page of the community section, one of those small articles most people skim past without thinking twice. The headline read, "Concerns raised over non-compliant agricultural property." They didn't mention my name directly, but the description made it obvious. A large ranch property bordering the eastern residential district. Complaints about livestock structures inconsistent with community guidelines. Speculation about whether the land was being maintained according to modern zoning expectations. It was written carefully, neutral language. Quotes from concerned residents. But the message was clear. Someone was trying to make my ranch look like a problem. A few days later, one of my neighbors stopped by the gate while I was repairing a section of fencing. He leaned against the truck door, hat pulled low over his eyes. "You seen what they're posting online?" he asked. I hadn't. He pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward me. The HOA community forum had an entire thread about the ranch now. Photos of the barn, photos of the pasture, even a zoomed-in picture of the livestock pens taken from somewhere along the road. Comments stacked underneath. "Looks unsafe. Not sure why this property gets special treatment. HOA should take stronger action. I stared at the screen for a moment. What's interesting, I said slowly, is some of those photos weren't taken from the road. My neighbor nodded. Yeah, figured you'd notice that. That's when I started paying closer attention. And once you start looking for surveillance, you begin to see it everywhere. The first drone appeared one afternoon while I was walking along the creek line. I heard the buzzing before I saw it, high-pitched, mechanical, hovering somewhere above the oak trees. I looked up just in time to catch a small black drone drifting slowly across the pasture. Not flying past, hovering. The camera pointed straight down toward the ranch. It stayed there for maybe 20 seconds before sliding sideways and disappearing back toward the subdivision. A few days later, it happened again. Different drone. Same hovering pattern. Same slow sweep across the barn and livestock pens. That's when the pieces started fitting together. The HOA inspectors weren't just relying on complaints anymore. They were collecting evidence, or at least trying to. The next clue came late one evening while I was checking the fence line near the north pasture. The sun had already dropped below the hills, leaving that dim gray light that settles in just before dark. As I walked past the gate post, something caught my eye. A small object mounted near the corner of the fence. At first glance, it looked like part of the wood grain, but when I leaned closer, the tiny red light blinking on its side gave it away. A camera. Not one of mine. Small. Battery-powered, and pointed directly at the pasture. I stood there for a long moment staring at it. Most people would have pulled it down right away. But years of military training had taught me something important. When someone shows you how they're watching, you learn far more by letting them continue. So I left the camera exactly where it was. I stepped back from the fence and scanned the tree line slowly, looking for anything else out of place. And that's when the realization settled in. The HOA wasn't just inspecting my property anymore. They were spying on it. Drones, hidden cameras, photos circulating online, which meant something very important had just changed. Because once someone crosses that line, they stop being regulators. They start creating evidence. And evidence, if you know how to use it, has a funny way of flipping a situation completely upside down. One thing the HOA never understood about ranchers is that we spend a lot of time reading documents. Not because we enjoy it, because land teaches you quickly that paper matters almost as much as soil. Titles. Deeds. Easements. Water rights. Those pieces of paper decide who controls what when the arguments start. And, after the drones, the cameras, and the inspection circus, I finally sat down one evening and started pulling out the old records my grandfather kept in the ranch office. The wooden filing cabinet in that room has been there longer than most of the houses in the HOA subdivision. Inside it are decades of paperwork, survey maps, handwritten agreements, and thick legal folders that trace the history of the ranch back through multiple generations. Most people would call it boring. To someone dealing with an HOA, it's ammunition. The first thing I reviewed was the original deed. That document predates the HOA by almost 50 years. Back when the land was still considered active agricultural territory and the surrounding hills were mostly open grazing land. And buried inside that deed was something extremely important, an easement clause. In simple terms, easements are legal rights tied to property that don't disappear just because new organizations appear nearby. They grant specific uses of land, things like access roads, water routes, or agricultural operations. And once they're recorded with the county, they sit above HOA rules, which meant the ranch already had protections the HOA couldn't simply override with a compliance letter. Then I pulled out another folder. This one contained agricultural classification documents filed with the state years ago. Ranches like this aren't treated the same way as suburban properties under many state and federal laws. Agricultural land often carries protected operational rights, livestock pens, fencing, equipment structures, noise, dust, all the things suburban HOA committees love to complain about. But those protections exist for a reason. Governments understand that working land operates differently from residential neighborhoods, which means when a ranch predates the development surrounding it, the law often favors the ranch. The final piece was something most HOA boards never bother thinking about at all: insurance liability. Organizations like HOAs rely heavily on liability insurance policies. Those policies protect them from lawsuits when they enforce rules or conduct inspections. But there's a catch. Insurance companies expect boards to follow legal authority when they take action. If an HOA begins trespassing, conducting unauthorized surveillance, or enforcing regulations outside their legal jurisdiction, those insurance protections can disappear very quickly. And when that happens, the board members themselves can become personally responsible for the consequences. Which means the entire strategy Elaine Whitmore had built her campaign on carried a very serious blind spot. Because the more aggressively the HOA pushed past their authority, the more leverage they accidentally handed to the person they were trying to intimidate. And by the time I finished reviewing those documents that night, one thing had become very clear. The HOA thought they were tightening a legal trap around the ranch, but the reality was something very different. Every step they took beyond their limits was slowly building the case that would eventually snap that trap shut on them instead. By the time the HOA decided to send their inspection convoy down my driveway that morning, the outcome of that encounter had already been decided. They just didn't know it yet. After weeks of letters, surveillance, and increasingly aggressive inspections, I finally made a phone call to someone who understood property law better than any HOA compliance board ever would. His name was Daniel Harper, and he had been practicing land and agricultural law in this county for nearly 30 years. Around here, when farmers or ranchers find themselves in disputes involving land rights, easements, or zoning pressure, Daniel is usually the first person people call. The reason is simple. He knows how rural property law actually works. When I first laid everything out for him, the letters, the fines, the hidden cameras, the drones, he listened quietly, flipping through the documents I brought with me. Then he leaned back in his chair and gave a small smile. Not the friendly kind. The kind lawyers get when they realize someone has handed them a case that's already half won. "Did they really install surveillance on your fence line?" he asked. "Battery camera," I said. "Still there." He nodded slowly. "That's helpful." Over the next few days, we built a file that would make any HOA board very uncomfortable. Certified copies of the original ranch deed, recorded easements dating back decades, agricultural classification records filed with the state, photos of the surveillance devices, drone footage timestamps, inspection records showing repeated entries onto private property without notice. By the end of the week, Daniel had assembled a folder thick enough to qualify as a legal weapon. But the most important step came next. He made a quiet call to the county sheriff's office. Now, out here, the sheriff doesn't usually get involved in HOA disputes. Most of those fights stay buried in civil courts and paperwork battles. But trespassing, unlawful surveillance, and harassment are a different story, especially when they start involving private land with agricultural protections. The sheriff agreed to keep an eye on the situation, discreetly. Which brings us back to that morning. The gravel driveway stretched from the main road all the way to the ranch house, cutting through the pasture like a pale ribbon of dust. When the HOA trucks appeared at the far end, they moved in confidently, engines rumbling, tires kicking up clouds of powdery gravel. From the porch, I could see everything, and more importantly, so could the camera mounted beneath the eave above the barn. What the inspectors couldn't see was what waited beyond the oak grove near the east fence line. Daniel Harper stood there quietly, suit jacket draped over one arm, a leather folder tucked under the other. From where he stood, he had a clear view of the driveway, but the inspectors couldn't see him yet. Further back, near the barn road, a sheriff's cruiser had just rolled into position, engine idling softly behind the structure. Two deputies stepped out slowly, not rushing, just observing, exactly the way professionals do when they expect something interesting to unfold. Meanwhile, the inspectors spilled out of their trucks like they owned the place, clipboards swinging, one of them already walking toward the gate with a bolt cutter hanging from his belt. Confident, relaxed, completely unaware that every step they were taking was already being documented. I leaned against the porch railing and watched them approach. Sun climbing higher, wind moving slowly through the pasture grass, and the entire situation balanced right on the edge of a moment they hadn't seen coming. Because the HOA believed they were arriving to enforce compliance, what they didn't realize was that they had just walked straight into a courtroom that had been quietly assembled right there on my ranch. The inspectors came in like they owned the place. 3 trucks rolled down the gravel driveway and stopped in a loose line near the barn. Doors opened almost immediately. 10 people stepped out, some wearing safety vests, others carrying clipboards thick with paperwork. The man with the bolt cutters was the first to move. He walked straight toward the gate like he'd done it 100 times before. I stayed where I was, leaning against the porch railing, watching, listening. Gravel crunched under their boots as they spread out across the yard. One of them lifted a camera and began snapping photos of the barn. Another pointed toward the livestock pens and started writing notes. No hesitation. No request for permission. Just assumption. The bolt cutter man reached the gate and placed a hand on the chain. "Private property," I said calmly from the porch. He glanced over his shoulder, barely acknowledging me. "Compliance inspection," he replied. "Routine enforcement." I didn't move. Didn't raise my voice. Just watched as he reached for the bolt cutters. That's when a new voice cut through the air. "Before you touch that chain," the voice said evenly, "I'd strongly recommend taking a look at this." The inspectors froze. The man with the cutters turned slowly. From behind the oak grove, Daniel Harper stepped forward into the open pasture, suit jacket over one arm, leather folder in the other. His walk was unhurried, confident in the way only experienced lawyers manage when they already know how the conversation ends. The inspectors exchanged quick glances. One of them frowned. "Who are you?" someone asked. Daniel stopped a few feet from the gate and opened the folder slowly. "Daniel Harper," he said, "agricultural property attorney representing Mr. Carter." A ripple of uncertainty passed through the group. Daniel pulled a document from the folder and held it up. "Certified deed records for this property," he said calmly, "including easements and agricultural protections that predate your HOA development by nearly 5 decades. No one moved. The bolt cutters lowered slightly. Daniel continued. "You've conducted multiple unauthorized entries onto private agricultural land." He flipped another page. "You've installed surveillance equipment along the fence line." Another page. "And according to these inspection records, you've attempted enforcement actions outside the scope of your HOA jurisdiction." The man holding the camera shifted uncomfortably. "That's not." Daniel raised a hand gently. "You may want to finish listening." He turned slightly and gestured toward the barn. That's when the sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly into view. The engine idled as 2 deputies stepped out. Not rushing, just watching. The inspectors turned almost in unison, confusion spreading across their faces. One of the clipboard carriers spoke first. "We're here under HOA authority." The deputy closest to the truck folded his arms. "Authority doesn't override trespassing law," he replied. Silence dropped over the yard. Daniel closed the folder halfway and looked directly at the bolt cutter man. "If you cut that chain," he said calmly, "you'll be committing criminal property damage in front of 2 deputies and a camera system that's been recording since her trucks crossed the gate." The man slowly lowered the tool. Across the fence line, a few vehicles had started appearing along the county road. Neighbors. Word travels quickly in rural communities. Some leaned against their trucks, others stood quietly near the roadside fence. Nobody spoke. They were just watching the same people who had been sending letters and inspections for months, suddenly realizing the situation wasn't unfolding the way they expected. One of the inspectors cleared his throat. "This seems like an unnecessary escalation." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Actually," he said, "this is restraint." He slid another document forward. "Because the alternative would be filing a civil harassment claim, unlawful surveillance complaints, and insurance liability notifications against your HOA board." The group went completely still. The confidence they'd arrived with had vanished. The man with the bolt cutters took a slow step backward from the gate. Daniel closed the folder. "Now," he said calmly, "you have 2 options." He pointed toward the driveway. "You can leave this property immediately and explain to your board why they attempted enforcement beyond their legal authority." Then he glanced briefly at the sheriff's deputies. "Or we can let the situation continue to unfold in a way that becomes far more expensive." For a long moment, no one spoke. Wind moved through the pasture grass. Dust hung quietly in the air. And then, without another word, the inspectors started walking back toward their trucks. The bolt cutters never touched the chain. For a moment, it looked like the inspectors might actually leave quietly. The bolt cutters hung uselessly at the man's side. Clipboards lowered. Cameras slowly disappeared back into truck cabins. The confidence that had carried them down the driveway only minutes earlier had drained out of the entire group. But then another vehicle appeared at the end of the gravel road, a black SUV. It rolled forward slowly, tires grinding across the dust until it stopped behind the inspection trucks. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Elaine Whitmore. Even from the porch, I could see the tight expression on her face. Sunglasses pushed up on her head, clipboard already clutched against her chest like a shield. She walked straight toward the gate. "What exactly is going on here?" she demanded. The inspectors exchanged nervous glances. No one answered. Elaine's eyes swept across the yard over the trucks, the deputies standing near the barn and finally settling on Daniel Harper. Her jaw tightened. "And you are?" Daniel gave a polite nod. "Counsel for the property owner." She scoffed lightly. "This is an HOA compliance matter." Then she gestured sharply toward the inspectors. "These individuals are here to document violations under our community covenant authority." Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into the folder again and pulled out a small photograph. He held it up between two fingers. "A camera," he said calmly. Elaine blinked. "Excuse me?" Daniel turned the photograph slightly so everyone could see it. "This device was recovered from the north fence line 2 days ago," he continued. "Installed on private agricultural property without consent." One of the inspectors shifted uncomfortably. Elaine crossed her arms. "We're allowed to document violations." Daniel smiled faintly. "From public property, yes." Then he turned another page in the folder. "But drone surveillance over agricultural land without authorization, that's a different matter." The deputies near the barn exchanged quiet looks. Elaine's confidence faltered just a little. "You're exaggerating the situation," she said sharply. Daniel gestured toward the barn roof. "That camera system above the porch has been recording since the inspection trucks crossed the property line." He let the words settle for a moment. "Which means we now have documented evidence of attempted forced entry, unauthorized surveillance, and trespassing." The silence that followed was thick. Elaine opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her gaze darted toward the inspectors as if expecting someone to jump in and fix the situation. No one did, because suddenly the story they had been telling for months, the one about community enforcement and compliance issues, was unraveling in front of everyone watching. And by now, people were definitely watching. More trucks had pulled up along the county road. Neighbors leaned against tailgates or rested their arms on fence posts. Nobody cheered or shouted, but the quiet attention of a rural crowd can feel heavier than any courtroom gallery. Elaine tried one more time. "This property has repeatedly violated HOA guidelines," she insisted. Daniel nodded calmly. "Yes," he said. "That's the claim." Then he tapped the folder. "Unfortunately for that argument, state agricultural law and recorded easements override HOA restrictions in cases where the property predates the development." He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the group. "Wish this ranch does." Elaine's face flushed red. "You saying we have no authority?" "I'm saying," Daniel replied evenly, "that your authority ends where state law begins." The sheriff's deputy near the cruiser finally spoke. "And based on what we've seen this morning," he added, "it looks like that line may have been crossed." Elaine's grip tightened around her clipboard. For the first time since she arrived, she looked uncertain. Daniel closed the folder with a soft snap. "You'll also want to speak with your insurance carrier," he continued. "HOA liability coverage typically excludes unauthorized enforcement actions." One of the inspectors muttered something under his breath. Another quietly climbed back into one of the trucks. Because everyone there understood what that meant. If the HOA had stepped outside its legal authority, their insurance might not cover the fallout, which meant lawsuits, fines, possibly personal liability for the board members involved. Daniel gestured lightly toward the driveway. "So I suggest ending this inspection." No one argued. Elaine stood frozen for another moment, her carefully controlled expression cracking just enough for the frustration underneath to show. Then she turned sharply and walked back toward her SUV. The inspectors followed soon after. Doors slammed. Engine started. One by one, the trucks rolled back down the gravel driveway, the same dust cloud trailing behind them, but this time it looked less like confidence and more like retreat. From the road, a few neighbors exchanged quiet nods. No applause. Just the subtle satisfaction of watching someone who had pushed too far finally run out of ground. And as the last truck disappeared beyond the gate, the entire ranch seemed to exhale, because the story the HOA had been telling for months had just collapsed. And once that kind of narrative breaks, it rarely comes back together again. The trucks disappearing down the gravel road wasn't the end of it. Not even close. Because when organizations like HOAs overstep their authority, the real consequences usually arrive later quietly, through paperwork and official notices that carry far more weight than any compliance letter they ever sent. Within a week, the situation had already started shifting. Daniel filed a formal complaint with the county outlining everything that had happened: the unauthorized inspections, the hidden camera on my fence line, the drone surveillance over agricultural land, and the attempted forced entry at the gate. But the most important piece wasn't the complaint itself. It was the evidence. Video from the ranch cameras. Photographs of the surveillance device. Inspection logs showing repeated, unannounced entries onto private land. When you place that kind of documentation in front of county officials and insurance investigators, things move quickly. The first blow landed on the inspection company the HOA had hired. Turns out their contract didn't give them authority to trespass on agricultural property or install surveillance equipment. Once the county reviewed the footage, the company received a formal warning and temporary suspension from conducting inspections in the district. Their management wasted no time distancing themselves from the situation. In a statement to the county office, they claimed their employees had been misinformed by the HOA board regarding enforcement authority. In other words, they blamed Elaine. Then the insurance questions began. Daniel had warned the HOA board about that part during the confrontation, but I doubt they took it seriously at the time. Liability insurers don't like surprises, especially the kind involving trespassing complaints and potential civil lawsuits. Once the footage and reports reached the HOA's insurance carrier, the board received a very uncomfortable letter. The policy would not cover legal claims arising from unauthorized enforcement actions, which meant if the dispute escalated into court, the HOA board members might be responsible for their own legal defense. Word of that spread through the subdivision quickly. HOA boards rely heavily on reputation and perceived authority. When residents start hearing that their leadership may have exposed the entire association to liability, confidence tends to evaporate fast. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet suddenly began asking questions at community meetings. Why were inspectors entering private ranch land? Who authorized surveillance equipment? Why had the board ignored state agricultural protections? Elaine Whitmore tried to maintain control of the situation, but the tone had changed. The same confidence she carried onto my property that morning was nowhere to be seen now, because when authority collapses in public, it doesn't just damage a decision. It damages the people who made it. And in this case, the HOA leadership had pushed their power just far enough that the entire community was now forced to look at what they had done. The inspection trucks had left my ranch that morning, but the consequences they drove back with them were only beginning to unfold. After the dust settled, something interesting happened. The ranch went back to doing what it had always done: work. Early mornings returned to their normal rhythm. The sun would climb slowly over the hills, casting long orange light across the pasture while the cattle moved toward the feeding troughs. I'd walk the fence line with a cup of coffee in one hand, checking posts, listening to the wind slide through the tall grass. No inspectors. No drones, just the sounds that belong there. Hooves shifting in the dirt, the creak of the barn doors, water moving quietly through the creek at the lower end of the property. For weeks, the ranch had felt like it was under a microscope. Now it felt like land again. The livestock pens were busy as usual, calves pushing against the rails while feed buckets rattled. The barn roof got a few repairs that had been waiting since before the HOA nonsense even started. Not because anyone told me to, just because that's what you do when something belongs to you. One afternoon, I cleared a fallen branch from the creek bank that had been blocking part of the water flow. The current started moving freely again, sliding past the stones the same way it had when I was a kid sitting there with a fishing line. It was quiet work, the kind that reminds you what matters. But the bigger change didn't happen on the ranch. It happened in the community. People started stopping by again. First, it was a neighbor from 2 properties over who pulled his truck up by the gate and leaned out the window. "Looks like things got sorted," he said with a small grin. "Seems that way," I replied. A few days later, another rancher down the road stopped by with a bag of feed he'd picked up in town. "Figured you could use this," he said. Then he lowered his voice slightly. Most of us were hoping somebody would push back. Conversations at the feed store got easier again, too. The quick nods had returned to full waves. Folks asked about the cattle, the creek levels, the upcoming branding season. And every now and then, someone would quietly say something like, "Heard that lawyer of yours shut them down pretty good." I'd usually just shrug. Because the truth is, the victory wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about restoring balance. Out here, communities work best when people respect the boundaries that keep everyone living side by side. Neighbors, farmers, even the occasional HOA development. But respect goes both ways. And once the HOA learned that lesson, the tension that had been hanging over the valley for months finally lifted. The ranch was still here. The fences were still standing. And the land that had carried my family for generations was exactly where it belonged. Right where it had always been. A few weeks after everything settled down, I found myself back in the ranch office one evening. The sun was dropping behind the hills, casting long shadows across the pasture outside the window. The cattle were quiet. The wind moved softly through the oak trees the same way it had when I was a kid swinging from those branches. On the desk in front of me sat my grandfather's journal. I opened it slowly, letting the familiar creak of the leather cover fill the quiet room. The pages still carried the same smell of old paper and dust. Lines of tight handwriting stretched across each entry, notes about cattle drives, storms, broken fences, and long winters that tested the land and the people working it. I stopped on one page dated nearly 70 years ago. "Land teaches patience." I smiled a little when I read that. Back when my grandfather wrote those words, he was probably talking about weather, cattle, and the slow rhythm of ranch life. But the older I get, the more I realize those words apply to almost everything. Outside the window, I could hear laughter. My kids were running across the pasture near the barn, chasing each other through the tall grass the same way my cousin and I had done years ago. The rope swing still hung from the big oak tree, moving gently in the breeze. The ranch house porch light flickered on as the evening settled in. And near the front gate, the American flag we kept mounted on the fence post moved slowly with the wind. Simple things. The kind that remind you why you fight for places like this in the first place. Because land isn't just dirt and acreage. It's memory. It's history. It's the quiet promise that if you protect something long enough, the next generation might get the chance to build their own story on it too. The HOA trucks were gone. The letters had stopped. And the ranch was still standing exactly where it belonged, just like it had been for generations. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with fireworks or headlines. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of a gate that stays closed, a fence that stays standing, and the calm knowledge that you didn't let anyone take what wasn't theirs to begin with. Now I'm curious about something. If you've ever dealt with an HOA or any situation where someone tried to push their authority a little too far, I'd like to hear about it. Share your story down in the comments. Some of the wildest property disputes I've ever heard came from folks who thought they were the only ones dealing with something like this. And if you enjoy real stories about land rights, legal battles, and the occasional HOA getting reminded where their authority actually ends, make sure to subscribe. Because out here, there are plenty more stories where patience, paperwork, and a little bit of backbone turn the tables in ways people never expect.